Thanks, Ben.
And it's good to hear some announcements too. It's always good when we put on an event as a paper and we get a story out of it, so thank you.
I don't think you're short of stories, Ben.
They're all good. Look, we had a really tragic development today that is very related to what you have spoken about and was published today in the Telegraph, and that is about the serious issue of borders and border restrictions. Would it be fair to say there's no greater mission for the National Cabinet than to sort this out?
Well, I want to start by saying that the National Cabinet has never resolved to establish internal borders. Early on in the pandemic, we resolved to do a number of things. There were closures that were put in place, and they were done across 8 territories and state jurisdictions. And I think that process created a lot of certainty, but at the same time, we're very conscious of the changes that were being made. We're going to have very real impacts for people. I'd say there's probably only been 2 areas of significant disagreement that has occurred in the National Cabinet, and I don't think the Premiers would disagree with me on this. There were some disagreements about school closures. People know what my position on that was. Ultimately, they are decisions that states and territories make. But there was an honest discussion and there was a robust debate. And there's also been a discussion of borders. And there has been a different practice. So this is why it's hard. With New South Wales and Victoria and the Commonwealth, we actually got on the phone, realised there was a medical problem, agreed that this is what we've had to do, and then we worked together as best as we could to try and make it as workable as possible. There's been a border commissioner for some time on that border, and that border commissioner has been drawn in to help work with some of these problems. But as I said before, you impose a border, you can't help but cause problems. That's why we got rid of them in the first place. Other states and territories, South Australia, Tasmania, Queensland, Western Australia, imposed either direct borders or quasi-borders unilaterally. And at the time that was done, I've got to say, this was early on in the pandemic, it wasn't the most pressing issue at that time. In hindsight, I think back then we should have addressed the principles around how those borders were being created at that time. If I had my time over, then I think we would have spent more time on that. But frankly, at that point in time, we were looking at people digging mass graves in New York, and we were dealing with the difficulties of building up our health systems to ensure we had enough respirators and ICUs, and there was a lot of uncertainty. That's not an excuse, that's just an explanation. So now we find ourselves in this situation where there is, I think, too much inconsistency between these arrangements. We've endeavoured to get some principles that have sought to underpin how these work. States obviously can ultimately take their decision about how they apply this, but my appeal to them, and I think today, is just, many of us in this room are parents, it's unthinkable. And to know that this family has had to be dealing with border permits at a time when only one thing should have mattered, and that was the health of this young child. I just don't know what to say to that, Ben. I think we all feel the same. So let's hope we can get some greater consistency, some greater transparency. We can look to the other examples. I commit myself to work with that with the states and territories. I hope we can get some better arrangements. I'm not here to make criticisms or do anything like that against any jurisdiction, but let's, on behalf of Australians, we've got to try and get this worked out.
So just how we're going to roll with this is we're going to have 1 or 2 questions from the floor, and we've also, in a very COVID-aware approach, we've got a couple of 1 or 2 video questions as well. So just on the issue, I want to just stay briefly on the issue of borders. Getting the CMO involved, it seems to me that's a good approach in order to take perhaps political considerations a little bit more out of it.
Yeah.
And make it more about common sense approach. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah, and look, I particularly thank Stephen Marshall, who was instrumental in sort of getting us into this place with the states, and for the Acting Chief Medical Officer, and they're working with the medical expert panel now to get what is a hotspot. Now, Northern Territory has actually had a pretty reasonable way of doing this, and it's quite flexible and it moves from particular places. If there are cases, they make a decision and then they move them off fairly quickly. And the reason I just went over there is this is what happens in Denmark. They have a sort of a yellow-orange light system because in Europe people are still moving around. Now, I'm not suggesting this is precisely what we do in Australia, but hotspots are defined where there's an incidence of per 100,000 inhabitants per week below 20, where there's these cases. So they have clear metrics like this which say this goes yellow and orange and different quarantine arrangements apply, or whether you can go there or not go there. I think that's quite a sensible approach. Now, the specifics of that I'll leave to the medical experts to work out what is the right concentration of cases to represent a hotspot. And the whole point about containing outbreaks is it's important that people don't move from a hotspot in Melbourne to Brisbane, but it's also important that if there are a hotspot in Brisbane, they don't go to Ipswich. And so what matters is the outbreak and containing it there and as localised as possible. And I think these sort of systems have to do this. Now, I can assure you this, there will be a Commonwealth definition of a hotspot, come rain, hail or shine. I hope it's a national cabinet one, and I will certainly seek to achieve that. But at the very least, there will be a Commonwealth one, and if there are any differences to that, well, people can explain them.
Yeah.